September 19th, 1944. Somewhere near the fog-veiled hills outside Ericourt, France, a 20-year-old replacement named Walter Kowalski sat in the loader's seat of an M4 Sherman tank, gripping a shell he could barely hold steady. The dew from early morning still clung to the hedgerows, and smoke from artillery the night before settled low in the trees like ghosts who hadn't left the field. From a distance, 3 Panzer IV tanks were closing, dark silhouettes against the pale sky, lumbering forward through the churned-up French countryside. The commander shouted coordinates. The gunner was trying to traverse. The driver braked hard into a hedgerow. And Walter? He had one job: load the shell fast before the enemy got the first shot off. But the man who should have been in Walter's seat was already gone, killed 2 days prior when a German round slammed through their turret like a fist through paper. Walter was a mechanic. He'd loaded shells exactly 4 times before this, in training, on a calm range, with instructors walking the line. Not here, not with death crawling toward them across the morning fog. He reached for the shell. It weighed 38 pounds, thick with high explosives. His hands were slick, oil and sweat. Everything inside the turret stank of cordite and gasoline. The breech waited open, steel jaws ready to accept its meal. Walter tried to remember the method. He'd been shown once: Fort Knox doctrine, road and robotic. Face the breech, shell nose forward, brass base aligned, ram home, step clear. Let the gunner fire. 4 seconds if you were good, 5 if you were nervous. More than that, and someone could die. But there was a problem no one at Fort Knox had considered. Walter was left-handed. The turret, the entire Sherman, had been designed around right-handed loaders. Every ready rack, every access grip, every clearance assumption in those blueprints was for someone who could pivot right, lead with their dominant hand, and never bump shoulders with the man next to them. But when Walter turned to face the breech the proper way, his left elbow collided hard with the gunner's shoulder. The gunner swore and shoved him. The shell nearly slipped. The commander shouted again. The Panzers were 600 yards out and closing. In a moment of pure panic, Walter broke every rule they'd ever taught him. He turned his back to the breech, reached behind himself with his dominant left hand, and blindly felt for the chamber opening. His fingers brushed the hot steel rim. Using his right hand to guide the base, he shoved hard. The breech clanged shut behind him. The gunner fired without waiting for clearance. The blast of heat slammed into Walter's back like a furnace door being opened in his face. His ears rang, his neck burned, but the shell was gone, one down. No one said anything. Walter had already grabbed the next round. Same motion. Back turned, left hand reaching, right hand ramming. 3 seconds. Boom. The Panzers returned fire. A shell screamed past the turret and exploded behind them, lifting earth and roots into the air. Walter was already loading the third. 2.5 seconds. The gunner barked, "Clear!" Boom. Smoke choked the compartment. Someone coughed. The commander shouted for bearing correction. 4th shell. 2 seconds flat. The recoil slammed the breech back into its track, heat washing over Walter's back again. Out through the small vision slit, he could see the fire begin to rise behind a line of brush. 1 Panzer hit, then another. The third one tried to pivot, reverse, but they tracked it. Hit it at 400 yards. Fire bloomed in the distance. 6 minutes, 4 kills. When it was over, nobody spoke for a long moment. Walter stood there, back to the breech, his hands black with powder residue, his arms shaking with adrenaline and fatigue. The gunner looked at him as if he'd just seen a ghost. The commander climbed down from his hatch and stared through the turret. Then finally, he asked, "What the hell did you just do?" No one had ever seen a loader do that before, and certainly not in combat. It violated every page of every training manual written since 1942. No one turned their back to the breach. No one loaded blind. No one broke protocol like that. But it worked. And that morning, for a left-handed mechanic with a bruised shoulder and no combat experience, it was the only thing that kept them alive. What Walter didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that this moment, this accidental innovation born from fear, sweat, and desperation, would soon ripple through an entire division. Other loaders would see it. Commanders would whisper about it. Abrams himself would notice. And what started in a muddy field near Aracourt would change the way American tankers fought for the rest of the war. But before it spread, before it became a story worth telling, it was just one man inside a Sherman tank, doing what he had to do to survive, left-handed, out of place, out of time. And for the rest of his life, even long after the war was over, the sound of the gun's recoil still echoed in his dreams. The news spread faster than anyone expected. By the morning of September 21st, the backward loader story had reached the maintenance yards. Crews whispered about the left-handed mechanic who turned his back to the gun and beat the odds. Some thought it was a fluke. Others were already trying it. What mattered wasn't whether it was regulation. It was whether it worked under fire. And it did. Tankers weren't interested in manuals. They were interested in staying alive. In a Sherman, every second mattered. From the moment a German tank was spotted, the crew had maybe 10 seconds to line up, load, and fire. Any delay, any fumbled shell, mistimed motion, or elbow jammed against the breech meant the difference between hitting and being hit. Walter Kowalski's method shaved full seconds off that timeline. And in tank warfare, seconds were everything. The 4th Armored Division began quietly adopting the technique. Commanders didn't broadcast it. They didn't send memos up the chain. They watched, timed, and saw the results. On September 23rd, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams saw it for himself during a live-fire training drill. Abrams was known for two things: his aggression and his ability to adapt. The man had already led armored charges through German lines and was fast becoming one of Patton's most trusted commanders. When he saw a loader turn his back to the breech and ram a shell in 3 seconds flat, he halted the exercise and demanded an explanation. What he got was a first-hand account from Sergeant Miller and Walter himself. Abrams didn't lecture. He didn't threaten court-martials. He asked one question: "Does it work better than what's in the manual?" "Yes, sir," Miller replied. That was all Abrams needed. He ordered every loader in his battalion to be trained on the method immediately. No red tape, no delay, just results. Within 72 hours, more than 100 Sherman crews were using the technique in active combat across France. The improvement was measurable. Engagements were shorter. Hits came quicker. Panzer crews, once used to having the edge in a duel, were suddenly being outgunned by American tanks that shouldn't have had a chance. Abrams passed his findings to Patton directly. The general, already known for favoring what worked over what was written, saw the kill ratios, the reduced engagement times, the survivability improvements, and made a call that would ripple through the entire Third Army. By October 7, 1944, Patton had issued an order. Every battalion in Third Army would adopt the new method. Field commanders were told to prioritize performance over procedure. If a loader's back-to-the-breech technique kept their tank firing faster, that was the new standard. Anyone caught punishing their crew for using it would answer directly to Patton. That same week, Walter was brought in again, this time not as a curiosity, but as a teacher. He stood in front of 60 tank loaders from across the division and demonstrated, step by step, exactly how he loaded a 75mm shell backward in 3 seconds or less. No charts, no theory, just muscle, instinct, and repetition. The loaders practiced. At first, some struggled. Years of training didn't undo easily, But as soon as they saw their time drop, 5 seconds, 4, 3, they understood. Within a day, they had it. Within a week, the entire division had adopted it. Meanwhile, the Germans noticed something was wrong. Radio intercepts from the Wehrmacht in late October referenced unusually high rates of fire from American tank units. One after-action report from a German Panzer commander near Nancy stated that Sherman tanks were firing as quickly as field artillery, suggesting new weaponry or support fire. It wasn't a new gun. It was Walter's left hand. The improvement didn't stop with the Sherman. Crews operating the upgunned M4 A3E2 jumbo Shermans, which carried a 76mm cannon, began adapting the backward loading method as well. These shells were longer and slightly heavier, but the same physics applied. And while the jumbo couldn't go toe-to-toe with a Tiger from the front, it could now fire fast enough to land multiple shots in the time it once took to fire one. Speed became survival, and for once, the Americans had the edge. Back in the States, Fort Knox trainers started hearing rumors. Letters came in from frontline commanders asking about modified breech-loading procedures. No official directive had been sent. The technique hadn't made it into the manuals. But the battlefield was writing its own doctrine now. Veterans returning from France began training new recruits using Walter's method without even thinking about it. It had become second nature. Instructors noticed that these returning tankers had fewer fumbled shells, faster breach times, and better coordination under stress. They didn't ask questions. They just took notes. By November, Walter Kowalski's name was circulating quietly through logistics channels. Supply clerks noticed requests for loader gloves were increasing, not just standard-issue pairs, but left-handed specialized ones. Someone high up asked why. The answer? Because backward loaders were burning through gloves faster than anyone else. The powder blasts from the recoil were hitting the loaders directly. One colonel joked that they needed to start issuing fireproof jackets to the loaders now. Nobody laughed. Across the Atlantic, in tank battalions stationed in Belgium and the Netherlands, whispers of the technique were spreading. Replacement crews arriving from the States were bringing it with them. In a war where tank duels were often decided in the first few seconds of contact, the backward loading method was saving lives before anyone could figure out how or why. The Germans, of course, didn't know what had changed, but they could feel it. Crews who once counted on the delay between American shots to reposition or counterattack now found themselves on the defensive. Panzer foes that used to survive the first hit now took 3 in a row before they could respond. Panther crews, usually calm under pressure, were calling in artillery cover faster than before. Something was wrong. Something had shifted. And that shift had started in the cramped turret of a Sherman tank, with a scared left-handed mechanic doing what nobody had taught him. Walter never bragged. When asked later about the day he loaded 4 shells and destroyed 4 tanks, he just shook his head. "I wasn't thinking," he'd say. "I was just trying not to die." But that moment, those 6 minutes of fire, smoke, sweat, and steel, reshaped how an entire generation of tankers fought. It wasn't written down. It wasn't authorized. It wasn't even allowed. But it worked. And when the rules don't work in war, the smart soldiers break them. That's how real heroes are made. Walter Kowalski's innovation didn't stay hidden for long. 2 days after the battle near Araort, where 4 German Panzer IVs were reduced to smoking wrecks, whispers began rippling through the 37th Tank Battalion. Crews who had fought beside Sergeant Miller's tank started asking questions. How did you survive? How did you kill 4 Panzers in 6 minutes? Some thought it was luck. Others thought it was a new type of shell. But when they watched the loader in action, when they saw Walter Kowalski turn his back to the breech and load a 75mm shell in under 3 seconds, they understood. This was no trick. It was a method, and it worked. By the end of that week, other crews were experimenting, quietly, carefully. No one dared write it down. The Army field manual was clear. Loaders must face the breech, maintain eye contact with the round, and step clear before firing. Violating those steps wasn't just against training, it was grounds for disciplinary action. So they whispered. They practiced behind tanks, late at night, with empty shell casings and bruised shoulders. At first it was 3 crews, then 5, then entire platoons. The results were undeniable. Crews using Walter's backward method were faster, more fluid. They engaged targets quicker, and their survival rates climbed. Then Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams found out. Abrams was no stranger to bold moves. He was a rising star in the Armored Corps, known for his aggressive tactics and steel-cold focus under fire. He had led tank columns through the hell of Normandy and into the heart of France. His name would one day be emblazoned on the M1 Abrams tank, but in September 1944, he was a battalion commander with an instinct for innovation. He was observing a live-fire drill near Lunéville when he noticed something strange. One Sherman crew was firing faster than the others, much faster. Abrams approached and demanded to see the loader. It was a wiry corporal who had served with Sergeant Miller. Abrams ordered a demonstration. The loader turned his back to the breech, gripped the shell, and loaded in one smooth backward motion. 2.8 seconds. Abrams raised an eyebrow. Again. The loader did it again. 2.9 seconds. Again. 3.1 seconds. Abrams didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply nodded and asked who had taught him. The name came out quietly. Walter Kowalski. The next morning, Abrams summoned Sergeant Miller and Walter to a training ground. Abrams didn't speak much. He simply said, "Show me." Walter loaded 5 shells, each in under 3 seconds. Abrams checked the times with his own watch. Then he walked to the edge of the training field, lit a cigarette, and said the words that changed everything. "Teach it to everyone." Just like that, the backward method went from whispered rebellion to battalion-wide doctrine. By September 26th, every tank crew in the 37th Tank Battalion had been shown Walter's technique. Abrams didn't ask for permission. He didn't clear it with command. He simply issued a standing order. Use what works. He understood the stakes. Every second saved meant one less flag-draped casket. The results came fast. Engagement times dropped. Kill ratios improved. Panzer crews that once had the advantage were now being outgunned and outpaced by Shermans they once considered inferior. But this wasn't just about speed. It was about morale. Sherman crews had spent months watching their tanks brew up, watching friends die because they couldn't load fast enough, because the German 75mm or 88mm guns struck first. The death ratio, 5 Shermans for every 1 German tank, was burned into every commander's mind. Now that ratio was shifting. Now Shermans were hitting first. Word spread from battalion to division. By early October, 4th Armored Division was actively retraining loaders using the new method. No official documentation. No changes to the field manual. Just veterans passing knowledge down the line. Just loaders teaching loaders how to stay alive. Meanwhile, Walter kept loading. He didn't see himself as an innovator. He wasn't trying to rewrite doctrine. He was just a kid from Detroit trying not to die in a steel box under fire. But his method, born from a dislocated shoulder and raw desperation, was rewriting the rules of armored warfare. More crews adopted the method. In skirmishes outside Nancy, a Sherman platoon using backward loading recorded a 3-to-2 kill ratio, Shermans outshooting and outlasting Panzer IVs and Panthers alike. Tank commanders began requesting replacements who had the new technique. Training officers began asking around, "Who's that Kowalski guy? What unit's he in?" On October 3rd, General Patton received an after-action report that caught his attention. It detailed a series of engagements where Sherman tanks were consistently outperforming expectations, not because of new equipment, but because of improved loader performance. The report didn't mention names, but it mentioned Abrams, and Patton trusted Abrams. 3 days later, Patton himself arrived at 4th Armored Division HQ. He watched Walter demonstrate the technique. He timed the motions. He looked into the turret of a Sherman and saw the cramped space, the bruises on the loader's arms, the burned fabric along Walter's back. He didn't need a second opinion. He turned to his chief of staff and said, "If this gets our boys home faster, I don't care what the damn manual says." That day, October 6, 1944, Patton issued a verbal directive to all 3rd Army armored units: adopt the backward loading method immediately. Commanders who resisted were warned. Safety officers were told to stand down. This wasn't about regulations anymore. This was about winning. Thousands of loaders across 3rd Army learned the method in the weeks that followed. Informal training sessions sprang up behind mess tents, beside tank garages, in muddy fields lit by lanterns. Tankers practiced the motion until it burned into muscle memory. Back turned, shell gripped, breach found by feel, 3 seconds, repeat. The Shermans, once considered underdogs, began hitting harder and faster. Panther crews noticed. Panzer IV commanders started reporting increased losses from unexpected flank shots. Luftwaffe recon pilots began spotting fewer burning American tanks. In the space of 3 weeks, Walter Kowalski had helped shift the battlefield odds, not by invention, but by improvisation, not by command, but by necessity. And he still wasn't done. Word spread quickly through 4th Armored Division. By the end of that same week, crews from other battalions were sending men over to watch Walter Kowalski demonstrate his loading technique in the maintenance yard. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't need it. Tankers talk. And when a loader can fire faster and stay alive longer, the whole unit listens. By October 1st, Walter's backward method had been quietly adopted by over half the loaders in 4th Armored. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody dared to make it official. But in practice, it was becoming the new standard. That was when Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams stepped in. Abrams wasn't the kind of officer who cared about red tape. He was a battlefield commander, aggressive, decisive, and above all else, practical. His battalion, the 37th Tank Battalion, had already made headlines for its daring drive to Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. Abrams had no patience for a procedure that didn't work. When he heard about Kowalski's method, he didn't scold anyone. He just watched. What he saw was impossible to ignore. Loaders working faster, crews surviving longer, engagements won that might have otherwise been lost. So Abrams made a call. He ordered every loader in the 37th to be retrained using the new method. He pulled Walter off combat rotation for 48 hours, assigned him to demonstrate the technique in person to the battalion's training officers. Abrams understood something that bureaucracy never did. War doesn't wait for approval. If something worked, you used it now. The response was immediate. Within 3 days, every loader in the 37th was using the backward method. Shells were going into the breach in under 3 seconds. Crews were firing faster, landing more hits, and recovering from engagement without casualties. Abrams didn't stop there. He sent word to neighboring battalion commanders, inviting them to observe the training. Some came. Some hesitated. The field manual still forbade the technique, and changing battlefield protocol without HQ approval was risky. But Abrams' kill ratios spoke louder than any manual. By October 5th, whispers of the technique reached 3rd Army HQ. And at the top of that chain was General George S. Patton. Patton was a man who despised hesitation. He lived by speed, aggression, and initiative. When he read the reports from Abrams's battalion, Faster loading, fewer crew losses, better performance under fire. He wanted answers. So, on October 7, 1944, Patton arrived unannounced at 4th Armored's forward command post. He didn't sit through a briefing. He didn't call for charts or graphs. He asked for one thing. Show me. Walter Kowalski was summoned. Still recovering from powder burns and nerve damage in his shoulder, he climbed into a Sherman tank parked behind HQ and demonstrated the method. Patton watched in silence, stopwatch in hand. 2 seconds, 2.3, 2.5. Again. The general stepped down from the tank, handed the stopwatch to his adjutant, and gave the order. Every battalion in 3rd Army adopts this method. Immediately, any officer who objects can explain themselves to me in person. It was done. From that moment forward, Walter's technique went from whispered workaround to Army-wide directive. Trainers were pulled from frontline units and sent back to base camps to teach new crews the backward load. Veteran loaders were ordered to demonstrate the technique to incoming replacements. What had begun as a desperate improvisation by one wounded mechanic became the official, albeit unwritten, standard across 11 armored divisions. It worked. By late October, the tank-kill ratio in the European theater began to shift. American crews were no longer being chewed up at 4-to-1 losses. Engagement times dropped. More crews survived their first contact. Tank commanders began reporting kills from unexpected positions. Tanks that would have been destroyed moments earlier now getting the first shot in because the gun was loaded faster. In combat, seconds meant survival, and Walter had shaved off 2, sometimes 3 seconds per round. But that success came with a strange burden. Because the change was never formally added to the Army's training manuals, Walter Kowalski received no official credit. No medals, no citations, not even a mention in the after-action summaries beyond vague references to improved loader efficiency. And yet his influence grew. At Fort Knox, training officers began informally teaching variations of the backward method. By mid-November, every tank school in Europe was using it. In December, Patton's staff requested that training films be updated to reflect the changes. But even then, they stopped short of acknowledging Walter by name. He didn't care. Walter wasn't interested in recognition. He cared about his crew, about the men whose lives might depend on how fast he could work. In the weeks that followed Patton's order, Walter stayed in his tank, stayed on rotation, and kept loading, shell after shell, each one a split second faster than the last. His crew, once skeptical, now trusted him implicitly. The gunner knew Walter could get the next round in before the Germans could fire again. The commander gave orders with confidence, knowing the gun would always be hot, always ready. The driver maneuvered into tighter spots, trusting the turret could fire fast enough to cover him. Walter had changed the tempo of their battles, and he wasn't alone. Stories began to surface from across 3rd Army. Left-handed loaders finding success with the backward method. Right-handed loaders adapting it to their own rhythm. Tankers surviving ambushes because their guns were hot when the Panzers rounded the corner. One crew in the 6th Armored Division used the technique to destroy 6 Panthers in a single engagement. Another in the 10th Armored survived an ambush by firing 8 shells in 22 seconds. Something deemed impossible just 2 months earlier. Even in the bitter cold of December, during the Battle of the Bulge, crews remembered Walter's method. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, where tanks bogged down and turret rings froze solid, loaders kept working. Back turned to the breech, arm reaching behind, eyes closed, just muscle memory, smoke, and survival. The backward method spread beyond Europe. Tank instructors began showing it to Marines in the Pacific. Crews in Okinawa adopted it for their close-range fights against bunkers and hidden tanks. In 1945, the technique crossed oceans. and it kept spreading. But through it all, the name Walter Kowalski stayed out of the spotlight. He didn't want fame. He wanted to live and help others do the same. The final act of his legacy and the closing section of this story will show just how far that ripple effect traveled after the guns went quiet. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Walter Kowalski had survived 14 combat engagements. His tank had been hit 3 times. He walked away from every one of them. His crew, hardened by fire and bonded by survival, finished the war with 23 confirmed enemy tank kills. Walter loaded every single round, using the backward method that began as a desperate improvisation in a burning field outside Arrowort. They called it luck. Walter called it doing his job. The official histories of the war don't mention him. If you look through the after-action reports for 4th Armored Division, you'll see vague references to improved loader performance and faster reload times. You won't see the words backward method. You won't find his name in the credits, because that's how these stories usually go. Walter Kowalski was just one of thousands, one loader in one tank in one battalion. He wasn't a general. He didn't win a medal. He didn't write a book. He just survived. And in doing so, he helped others survive too. But the story didn't end with VE Day. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, the U.S. Army found itself again using Sherman tanks. Many of them were upgraded with improved guns and armor, but the core design and the need for a fast loader remained. Tank battles around the Pusan perimeter were close, violent, and chaotic. Once again, seconds mattered. And the technique that Walter invented, ramming a shell home with his back turned to the breech, was taught to Marine Corps and Army tankers deploying to Korea. It wasn't called the Kowalski method. It was just the fast load. In training circles, instructors knew it made the difference between life and death. Veteran gunnery sergeants would walk the line during practice drills, shouting, 3 seconds, load it in 3 seconds or you're dead. The motion had become instinct for a new generation of loaders who never knew the man who'd figured it out with a busted shoulder and a burning tank all those years before. By the time Vietnam escalated in the 1960s, most American tanks had moved beyond the Sherman. The M48 Patton and later the M60 became standard. They had bigger guns, 90mm and 105mm, and different layouts, but the core problem remained: human loaders, cramped turrets, and the constant need for speed under fire. So the backward method was adapted, adjusted, tweaked for newer guns, heavier shells, and new threats. But the core principle remained: use your natural body mechanics, trust the motion, turn your back, feel the breach, let instinct take over. Training manuals never caught up. The Army never officially rewrote the breech loading procedure, but the method endured, passed down not on paper, but in practice, from veteran to rookie, from war to war. By the 1970s, the M1 Abrams tank was being developed. It would eventually include an automatic loader in some variants, but not all. Early M1 crews still had human loaders, and those loaders, especially ones trained by Vietnam veterans, were often taught variations of the backward method. Even as tanks became more advanced, with digital fire control systems, infrared sights, and composite armor, the loader's job remained brutally physical. Speed still mattered, and Walter's method still saved lives. He never talked about it much. After returning home to Detroit in 1945, Walter went back to his job as a mechanic at the Ford River Rouge plant. He married in 1947, had 3 children, lived a quiet life. He worked hard, put in 4 decades at the plant before retiring in 1986. To his family, he was just Dad, a quiet man with strong hands and kind eyes who could fix anything. He never bragged, never tried to get recognition. It wasn't until 1993 that a military historian researching tank tactics in the European theater stumbled across multiple references to unorthodox loading techniques in 4th Armored Division records. The historian, a former tanker himself, noticed the timelines matched up and began tracking down veterans. One name kept coming up: Walter Kowalski. The historian eventually found him, now in his 70s, living in Clinton Township, Michigan. He asked about the backward loading method. Walter smiled, shrugged, and said, "Wasn't anything special. Just something I had to do because my arm didn't work right." That interview turned into a published paper. The historian estimated that Walter's innovation, if scaled across the divisions that adopted it, may have contributed to saving 300 to 500 American tank crew lives between October 1944 and May 1945. It wasn't conclusive, but it was compelling, and it was enough to finally acknowledge the quiet legacy of a man who never sought credit. Walter died in 2004 at the age of 82. He was buried in Resurrection Cemetery just outside of Detroit. His military service was noted in his obituary, but there was no mention of the backward loading method, no plaque, no medal. But 7 men came to that funeral who had never met Walter before that day. 7 tankers, former loaders, veterans of Korea, Vietnam, and the Cold War. All of them had learned the technique from men who'd learned it from others, a chain stretching back 60 years to a muddy field in France. They came because they knew, because they understood what that man had given them. That's how war really works. Not always through grand strategy or sweeping offensives, but through small human decisions made in moments of chaos. A 20-year-old mechanic, out of his depth, hurt and scared, made a choice under fire. He turned his back to a 75mm gun and rewrote the book on survival. That's why we tell these stories. Because history isn't just about generals and medals. It's about the quiet heroism of people like Walter, the ones who didn't make headlines, but made all the difference. If you've been moved by this story, we ask you to do one simple thing: help us remember. Like this video. It helps us reach more people and keep these stories alive. Subscribe to Ghosts of World War II. Our mission is to preserve the memories of the men and women who served with courage, humility, and ingenuity. Leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, or if your family has a connection to the tankers of World War II. And above all, don't let these stories fade. Walter Kowalski never asked to be remembered. But now, thanks to you, he will be, forever.